With the A-10 aging badly and modern weapon systems exposing new weaknesses, the Air Force has begun looking into using other existing planes to carry the Warthog's baton. But a popular thought process is that the close air support mission it was made for still needs to be covered by a more dedicated plane, which the Air Force doesn't yet seem to have any plans to build or amass. And with the Hog fleet looking more like a field hospital with every passing day, the Air Force might need to think about putting in a backup quarterback until they can get a new starter into the lineup. And it has to be an attack plane we've already got. So what if instead of the other options out there, the Air Force drafted the Navy's top pick? Today we're going to look at something a bit different. Instead of saying the usual what is, we're going to say what if, and figure out if the Block 3 A-18 Super Hornet can do what the A-10 Warthog does until something better comes along. And to start sorting this boot-to-bottom Venn diagram, we need to know what the Hog does. So, bored from the need for an aircraft dedicated to the Close Air Support or CAS mission, a poke by the Army attempting to fill the role themselves with attack helicopters in the wake of Air Force neglect, and a new mobility-focused combat doctrine made from the expected challenge of fighting waves of enemy armor columns in Europe in a Cold War scenario, the A-10 was created from the AX program that started in mid-1966 and evolved into a full-fledged design competition over the next few years. After a series of fly-offs between its YA-10 prototype and the Northrop YA-9 competitor, the A-10 Thunderbolt II would become the chosen one, aka America's beloved Burt gun, aka the Warthog.
He is the chosen one.
No matter which knuckleheads have the audacity to claim influential roles over its design, the A-10 Thunderbolt II was designed and built by the design team at the New York Republic Aviation Division of then Fairchild Hiller under the leadership of a single absolute mad lad, Alexander Kartveli. This man is the direct father of multiple iconic strike fighters in U.S. history. He led the creation of the F-105 Thunder Chief from Vietnam, the F-84 Thunder Jet from Korea, and my personal all-time favorite plane, period, the P-47 Thunderbolt. If you want to wave your magic American flag and make something on the ground disappear, this is the guy you call to make it happen. This man should be named the Ghost Maker, because if you have a ghost problem, you call the Ghostbusters. But if you need a ghost problem, you call Kartveli and Republic Aviation, and they will send the bad guys to a different dimension. And the A-10 will make the enemy cross their streams with either up to 16,000 pounds of guided and unguided ordnance from 11 underwing hardpoints, or the 30mm GAU-8A Avenger cannon with over 1,000 rounds of ammo, some of which is made of armor-piercing depleted uranium. And after racking up a boatload of combat experience over Desert Storm, Allied Force, and other theaters, in 2007 the Air Force's A-10As began undergoing a series of upgrades to the next model, the A-10C, giving it more capabilities for putting warheads on foreheads like night vision, helmet-mounted sights, and GPS targeting. Because we don't want you to see us Deadpooling an aimbot.
Maximum effort.
And we definitely don't want to force our pilots to go full World War II gangster mode and fight at night using nothing but their Maverick missile targeting screen to go from point A for airfield to point D for dead guys. Unfortunately, over time, the A-10 has also had a number of weaknesses exposed, especially as the Air Force looks at some of the areas they might be fighting in next. For one thing, since the A-10 was intended to fly out of forward air bases with short and airstrips and go into combat all slow and smooth at low altitudes, it was strapped up with a pair of straight thick wings and large turbofan engines to maximize fuel economy, loiter time, and slow speed performance. However, these design choices are like putting on a ring because it limits the amount of fun the pilot can have. The A-10 capped out at a top speed of about 425 miles an hour with an airframe braking flutter limit of a bit over 500 miles an hour regardless of where it was, meaning that if you wanted to go farther than a couple hundred miles, it was going to take you a while and drive you absolutely insane. And with the Air Force preparing for battlefields like the Pacific where even the long-range air bases might come under fire, forward bases like the ones the A-10 was made for are pretty much out of the question. So the A-10s are going to have to hot-foot it in from much further out in order to make any attack runs at all, and if the similarly long-range missions it ran in the opening days of Desert Storm are any indication, that means the Warthogs will be spending several hours flying in to handle an attack mission they needed to be done at T-5 minutes from call-in. Granted, that's not an issue if they're already doing death donuts around the post postal code to begin with, and if they're flying low like they're supposed to, they won't be as concerned about radar-guided missiles either. But then they have to contend with man-portable air defense systems, or MANPADS, a short-range, shoulder-launched, usually heat-seeking missile that can be carried into anywhere and sent to mate with your tailpipe with zero warning. A-10 pilots have stated before they consider these weapons to be one of the biggest pains in said tailpipe because the A-10 only has a radar warning receiver. It doesn't have a general-purpose missile warning system, so pilots have to look for those MANPAD missiles with their Mark I eyeballs, probably while also using them to look around for their ground targets or lock in on a strafing run.
What do you think? I've got eyes in the back of my head?
Which is enough of a problem by itself because the A-10 pilots already rely on those for target ID, and because they're usually looking around from a higher altitude, sometimes that ID is the wrong one. While the A-10 is not the only plane to have caused friendly fire incidents over the last few decades, its documented blue-on-blue history is one of the easiest to access and is generally more extensive. And if you check through those reports and stories, all roads lead back to the A-10 not having effective identification friend or foe, or IFF technology for the pilots on board. This basically forced pilots to try and figure out whether that's a tan enemy tank blending in with the sand or a tan infantry fighting vehicle blending in with the sand from 5,000 feet up, which, as you might imagine, didn't go very well, especially for some of the British.
Are you stupid?
There are also issues outside of direct combat, because the A-10 has not aged well over the last few years. The Air Force has tried to retire the A-10 fleet on no fewer than 3 major separate occasions, with a few other soft attempts since the day its production ended in 1984. And after Republic closed down in 2003, keeping the Warthog around got a lot harder. Sticks and stones may break your bones, but a lack of spare parts will just kill you. And around 60% of America's remaining 162 A-10s cannot be thrown into combat due to degradation and a lack of upkeep. It's reported that many of these Warthogs can't even fire their big guns due to the lack of military-grade Legos to trade out for the broken ones. The Air Force states that they intend to shift the casserole onto the latest version of the F-15 Eagle, the F-15EX. But a lot of people argue that troops requesting air support for search and rescue missions and general ground combat will still need a platform strictly dedicated to the role of supporting troops on the ground with long loiter time and slower speeds. But a next-generation dedicated platform is going to take time. You gotta request designs, pick one, award prototype development contracts, test and pick the resulting prototypes, then adapt it to full service conditions via low-rate production, and train a unit on the new plane until they understand it well enough to call it initially operable.
You lost me at it's.
Then you can finally get to mass producing it and setting up the formalized training program to give new pilots an orientation before putting them in the seat. And this process takes years and years and years. You could pretty much expect a decade to pass before a new plane is ready to go. And last I was aware, the OA-1K Sky Raider 2 was being primarily issued to Special Forces, and no large-scale replacement program has been initiated. If a major conflict were to kick off in the near future, whether it be with China, Iran, or whoever it is that decides they want the smoke, America's gonna need something functional for the casserole now. So what would an A-10 replacement need? Considering both what it does well and what its issues are, we can boil down the priorities to 5 rough bullet points. And the first thing we should probably figure out, probably the most obvious one, is how to make the bad guy go boom. During Desert Storm, the A-10 did use its gun to destroy armored vehicles, but more often than not, pilots would drop their smart bombs first and their 30mm leads second. However, the gun would still prove to be valuable for mission types like search and rescue, where precision targeting isn't always available, while still occasionally experiencing the spontaneous need to inform somebody that their free trial of life has expired. So any aircraft replacing the A-10 will need to be capable of carrying larger numbers of precision air-to-ground munitions while still having a good enough onboard gun to ensure that gets deleted.
You may ask yourself, what is that shit? Just take your right index finger and point it at literally anything.
The A-10, while having 11 hardpoints, can typically only use 1 or 2 of the centerline 3, so in most cases it functionally has 10. So your best bet is for any replacement to carry a minimum of 10 weapons on external stations capable of dropping weapons guided by laser designation, thermal signature, television imagery, or GPS coordinates. We want to turn your fighting position into a multiple choice question, and the right answer is going to be all of the above. Additional weapons like harms for wild weaseling your way through air defenses or anti-runway bombs might make nice bonus points for flexibility, but they are definitely not what I would call a priority. Conceal carrying or just carrying a pair of sidewinders for turning self-defense into self-offense, however, would absolutely be ideal, so the plane can hold its own until somebody releases the eagle on whichever airborne chucklenut was dumb enough to walk into America's room. And speaking of America,
I'm going to need a new gun.
the 30mm Avenger cannon may be one of the most red, white, and blue reduction processes I've ever seen in my life, but the A-10 literally had to be built around it, and even attempting to use a watered-down 4-barrel version was usually too much for most planes to handle. However, a 20mm cannon would probably be as small as a newcomer should go to make sure they can still punch through any vehicle with the balls to basically wear cardboard for armor. Like when somebody says infantry fighting vehicle, that gun better hear the words incredibly f***ed vehicle instead. However, as you might have guessed, it's kind of important that an attack plane doesn't get turned into an IFV itself, which brings us to requirement number 2. Any replacement should prioritize evasion over durability, because the only thing better than getting shot and walking it off is not getting shot in the first place. There is always a certain volume of lead that will turn cover into concealment, and if somebody draws a bead on a plane without it being able to break out, then eventually that lead slinger is going to find out how many licks it takes. So while low and slow is needed for gun runs, having the thrust to go mock Jesus will help recover the speed needed to keep dodging.
Evasive maneuvers, squadron leaders, evasive maneuvers.
However, maneuvers alone generally aren't enough to dodge missiles unless you're a special kind of F-16 pilot. So the new sheriff in town is going to need a lot of countermeasures. These could be voluptuous quantities of chaff and flares, or they could be something more elegant, like onboard electronic jammers and IR dazzlers, the latter of which would be really helpful against MANPADS. However, it is generally unwise to put all your eggs in one basket, so some measure of durability or redundancy in important areas like flight controls as a fallback plan might be a good idea, but only if possible. And speaking of redundancy, pretty much relying only on the pilot for identifying targets has a bad habit of falling through, so a bit of redundancy in that department might also be a good idea. Requirement number 3 is therefore no doubt more robust target identification. If something is shooting at you, it's probably a bad guy. If it's not shooting at you, it's either friendly or it's not shooting at you yet, and figuring out which is which can mean the difference between a medal and a court-martial. This is one of those safety first cases where having multiple systems to do one job is probably a great idea, like sharing data between platforms and both sending and receiving US and NATO IFF signals, especially if you have to do it in either impaired weather or at night. And regardless of when and where, you're also going to have to stick around for a bit, so you know, you're there in case somebody needs you. So requirement number 4 is going to be really high endurance with a focus on good loiter time. That means having a higher drinking tolerance for fuel and the ability to chug on the go from a tanker so you can stay on station to make people punch drunk as long as possible. And easy maintenance is always helpful. The A-10 is practically predicated on being cheap and easy to fix. Requirement 2 says evasion over durability, so repair times might not be as big of a concern, and that lessens the need for available parts in the field. However, not having to spend an eternity touching the plane back up between flights means less money spent overall and more logistical capacity spent on things like bombs and bullets and turning bad guys into smears across the terra firma carpet. So requirement 5 is going to be fast and cheap maintenance wherever possible. And with threats always changing in a timeline to replacement unknown, if cheap upgrades can be added to the mix, then it gets more bonus points. Now that sounds like a lot of words, a lot of things strapped back to back, and it's starting to feel like an F-111 program revived. So let's sum up and review. Any cast replacement for the A-10 will need to do 5 things. 1. Carry a variety of precision-guided munitions and have a decently powerful gun as a backup. 2. It should be better at not getting shot than getting shot and walking it off. Help the pilots identify targets as much as possible, have a lot of gas for loiter time and range, and make it as cheap and easy as possible to keep in the fight and the war.
Seems simple enough.
And that brings us to the multi-billion-dollar question. Does the US military have an aircraft already in service that can be readily produced and fill all those cast requirements well enough for hopefully only a few years? The first thought everybody had was probably the OA-1K Sky Raider 2, which is a literal crop duster with guns and spy cameras. But it's also a slow prop driver and made specifically for special forces, so it probably isn't going to be produced in large numbers. That's the obvious one out. So now we need a backup plan, and for that backup plan, I would like to nominate the Block 3 FA-18 Super Hornets. After multiple failed stealth aircraft programs and government here-to-help moments, in 1999 the US Navy would bring the first Block 1 FA-18E and F Super Hornets into service to fill the capability gaps left behind by the retired KA-6D refueling planes, the aging A-6 Intruder attackers and EA-6B Prowler electronic attackers, and the endangered F-14 Tomcat interceptor fighters. McDonnell Douglas, which had been assimilated by Boeing 2 years prior, had supersized the original FA-18 Hornet and adjusted it to create a a more capable medium-range multi-role strike fighter that could throw around and land with more delete keys than its ancestor. This aircraft was made to drop a variety of ordinances of both the dear mother flavor and the we've been trying to reach you about your postal code's extended warranty flavor. The Super Hornet has access to pretty much every airmailing method in the book, while also being much cheaper to upgrade and maintain than most of its peers. As a result, it wouldn't take very long for the Block 1 to mature into the Block 2, and in recent years, the Block 3 has entered the chat. The latest and greatest Super Hornets have a lot of different advancements over the original Block 1, but its emphasis on all-weather precision strikes and maneuverability are what make it important here. Because while it may have the body and design of a fighter jet, the Super Hornet is actually pretty good at low and slow. Not only do the Super Hornet's leading and trailing edge flaps auto-deploy at low speeds by way of its integrated flight control system, but both the Hornet and the Super Hornet were built with a wing made for lower and more CAS-friendly speeds. Thanks to both its ground attack mission and the compatibility required for carrier operations, where most supersonic aircraft have a wing swept back by 45 degrees, the Super Hornet only sweeps back about 20 degrees. This tanks the speed where sound-breaking shockwaves start forming over the wing, called the critical Mach number, and that aerial natural 20 is a big deal when it comes to how fast you can go. Bigger is better, and with a lower roll of the weighted dice, the Super Hornet's top speed should also then be lower. Which it is. Compared to planes like the F-15 and F-22 that can break past Mach 2, the Super Hornet tops out at only Mach 1.6 to 1.8. But the fact that it can break the sound barrier at all is less due to its wing shape and more due to the general design principle that America's been smoking since World War II. That being that anything will fly if you give it enough thrust. As a result, the Hornets, both Legacy and Super, are much better suited to lower speeds by default than most of their peers.
I got this.
It also flicks around a lot better in a slow-speed maneuvering environment, where it can use a quadruple redundant fly-by-wire control system to dodge missiles and shrug off glancing blows by adapting its control response if it's missing a few pieces, although none of those backups are manual controls. It also usually has towed decoys that it can drag behind it as a missile meat shield for an extra layer of protection against what could have been a concerning climax to a brief window of excitement. Then it can use that American Aerospace Peruvian powder we call thrust to regain its airspeed after decoying and matrix dodging missiles the Block 3 detected automatically on its new laser and missile warning system, which is only one of the up-to-date IFF and situational awareness technologies it uses, not including any new ones that come along later and get bolted into its open systems architecture, a software setup made to be both cheaper and easier to update. These systems let the Super Hornets operate in any weather, any altitude, and at any time of day to make sure that whatever needs to die is the thing that actually dies. In fact, to date, the entire Hornet family is only responsible for one blue-on-blue CAS incident that I'm aware of, and that was with a Legacy Hornet. The Super Hornet has new systems improved over decades to reduce that risk even further, and after it lands back at base, it's one of the cheapest planes to maintain of its class, utilizing a design with a lot fewer parts and maintenance-friendly choices that allow all but 2 items to be replaced in as little as 30 to 45 minutes, and the entire airframe to be brought back from the brink of mechanical death in less than half a day.
Were you killed? Sadly, yes. But I live.
And with the entry of the Block 3, introducing ground units to their god of choice can now be done a bit farther away thanks to the addition of conformal fuel tanks, or CFTs. These CFTs can carry about 3,500 extra pounds of fuel without putting too big of chains on the flight performance. In fact, these CFTs were actually able to preserve the aircraft's glide rate by balancing the amount of lift it generates with the extra drag force it causes. Basically some aerospace magic that cancels out by PEMDAS. Now, the Navy has unchecked this box due to the additional stresses caused by the routine carrier evictions, but if you don't use carriers to take off, that's not really an issue, and the Australians want to buy some CFT-equipped Block 3s under that exact train of thought. So if the Air Force were to buy it to cover for the A-10 until something more dedicated comes along, they would also have the option of wanting it that way as well. Which begs the question, if we're looking at the numbers, how exactly does the A-18 Super Hornet, with conformal fuel tanks, compare to the A-10 in the CAS role? We'll go ahead and start with the obvious category of speed. Naturally, the Block 3 Super Hornet way outclasses the A-10 in top speed, because while the A-10 sits at a top speed of roughly 425 miles an hour, the A-18 Super Hornet generally tops out at somewhere just below 1,200 miles an hour when it's kicking the sound barrier in the nuts.
Would you please leave my testicles alone?
However, that top speed isn't very good for fuel life or operating range, and so when operating in the CAS mission configuration, the Super Hornet is better made to cruise at around 520 20 miles an hour. Also, for the purposes of this video, the FA-18 Super Hornet's cast configuration means it is carrying 7 Mark 82 500-pound bombs, 6 on the wings and 1 centerline, 2 480-gallon underwing tanks, 2 wingtip sidewinders, and either an AMRAAM or a targeting pod mounted to either inlet corner. So in cast configuration, the Super Hornet doesn't go flamingly faster than the Warthog, but it can easily pour the coal to it if somebody needs help. But what's really interesting is that the stall speed, or the absolute slowest a plane can fly without turning into a pothole, is lower for an unloaded or clean FA-18 Super Hornet than it is for a clean A-10. The Super Hornet's stall speed is 127 miles an hour, or 204 metric knot miles an hour, which is a tiny bit slower than the A-10's 138 miles or 222 metric knot miles an hour. However, that stall speed is without conformal fuel tanks, which adds some weight but also some lift, so it might be a little higher and thus more equal. And speaking of tanks, speed is great and all, but you're going to be going a whole lot of nowhere without fuel, so how much can they carry?
It ain't got no gas in it.
The A-10 can suit up with 11,000 pounds of gas, or just under 5,000 kilos on internal tanks alone. By comparison, the Block 3 Super with the CFTs equipped can carry just shy of a whopping 18,000 pounds, or a bit over 8,000 kilos. However, thanks to its sheer fuel economy and the sheer size of its 3 600-gallon external fuel tanks, the A-10 can play the good old Uno reverse card and boast a longer maximum ferry range of 2,580 miles, or nearly 4,200 knot miles. But it doesn't feel like it wins by as much as you'd think it should. With 3 smaller 480-gallon tanks bolted on and factoring in the conformals, the Block 3 clocks in at a max range of 2,210 miles, or just under 3,600 knot miles. That range has come a long way from the Legacy Hornet, because I was not expecting this thing to break 2K, let alone technically reach almost as far as the A-10 under non-combat conditions. But under cast conditions, things do change, and this is where we get to one of the biggest concerns about replacing the Hog: loiter time. The Hog is well known for its long loiter time of about 2 hours. But it's frequently overlooked that this loiter time was also designed around a very short combat radius, or distance from takeoff to the point of action, of only 290 miles. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Venn diagram, the Super Hornet was designed to hang out with its cast loadout for only 60 minutes, or 1 hour. But with full CFTs added on, it can do that loiter time at a longer combat radius of about 500 miles.
Hey, that's pretty good.
So that loiter time equation is almost equal on both sides, pretty much making it a tie. However, the A-10 breaks that tie when it comes to the total cost per flight hour, sitting pretty at $22,500 per flight hour in 2020, while the Super Hornet fleet was weighing in at just over $30,000 a flight hour the same year. And the A-10's about to put more distance between it and the Hornet, because it's time to talk about the kabooms.
Kaboom!
Yes, Rico. Kaboom.
The A-10 is well known for its 30mm gun with 1,174 rounds, while the FA-18 Super Hornet is stuck with a 20mm cannon housing only 412 rounds, both of which are perfectly centerline mounted in the nose. However, the FA-18 Super has a higher maximum payload capacity of 17,750 pounds to the A-10's 16,000 pounds, and it has the same number of hardpoints and can carry the same number of thermal-guided Maverick missiles, at least as long as the A-10 is using its somewhat problematic triple racks. But by and large, in most cases, the A-10 can carry way more bombs. Seriously, the Hog can carry enough explosives to level a small city, especially of the 500-pound class. At maximum, a Hog can storm into the AO with up to 18 unguided 500-pound bombs, or up to 17 laser-guided flavors, losing only 1 for the targeting pod. The Super Hornet can only carry 11 unguided 500-pound bombs and 6 precision-guided ones. However, some of those numbers are more theoretical than practical. It's like studying for a test versus actually taking it. You know all the facts and concepts, but you're not going to use every single one of them for every single question. While the A-10 could carry up to 18 500-pounders, in real combat in Desert Storm, it would more commonly carry a max of 12 alongside 2 Sidewinders and 2 Mavericks on single mounts, because the triple mounts were only compatible with older models and caused a bunch of issues. And the A-10's triple mounts did not have the integrated technology to relay GPS coordinates for JDAMs, so when it carried those, it was down to just 6, whereas the Super Hornet and its twin mounts have the ability to transfer that data and do not have to compromise.
No.
Also, just out of curiosity, I did look into the question of could the Super Hornet use the triple mounts, and turns out they were tested on the Super Hornet during prototyping. However, they were so tightly packed that it caused a collision risk between bombs, which is really not all that conducive to your life expectancy to have between explosive devices at Mach holy shit. So twin mounts it was, and those twin mounts are well suited to carrying weapons of the 1,000-pound class. The Super Hornet can carry 7 half-ton halos of the unguided or JDAM varieties, or 5 if you're using the high-drag parachute versions, and 4 if you're throwing the precision-guided Hey Brother Hail Marys. So what about the A-10? Well, we don't know. The A-10 apparently does not have a common record of carrying 1,000-pound bombs into combat, but based on what we know about the 500-pounders and considering the weight limits of the pylons, it can kind of be inferred that the A-10 should theoretically be able to assign a minimum of 1 half-ton halo to each of its 11 hardpoints, with a similar limit of 6 JDAMs. But for the other half-tonners tailor-made to your needs and location, my best guess is that the A-10 can carry 10 with its targeting pod, if it isn't capped at 6 just like the next level up, the full-ton backbreakers.
Watch this. Oh, the backbreaker! The backbreaker, baby!
And the A-10 definitely takes the cake here with a total of 6 2,000-pound bombs of any variety it can carry, while the Super Hornet gets stuck with a limit of 4 full-tonners of all types except the laser-guided Paveway 2s, of which it only gets 2. Not the bunker-busting Paveway 3s, though. Those it gets 4 of, because America didn't give you permission to put a bunker there. So in total, the A-18 Super Hornet may have a better combat radius, better onboard tech, and more JDAMs, but the A-10 counters those advantages with double the loiter time, a much bigger gun and ammo pool, lower maintenance costs, and higher standard payloads. So far, it's winning in the capability contest, but the Super Hornet still has an ace up its sleeve. It's still in production. The Warthog isn't the only plane getting up there in years. The Navy's Super Hornets are getting old too, and they're experiencing similar issues with getting a hold of spare Legos to patch all the holes. As a result, they have both ordered several Block 3s of their own and started processing upgrades to get their existing Block 2s up to the Block 3 standard. But this is going to get more difficult and expensive as time goes on, especially if Boeing closes down Super Hornet production in 2027 like they say they will. If the Air Force were to order Block 3s to supplement or replace the A-10 fleet, this would extend the life of the production lines and theoretically keep maintenance costs down for a little longer. It would also buy both the Navy and the Air Force enough time to stockpile some spare parts, which would give them a little extra wiggle room in the event that somebody starts a major fight in the next few years. With both the Navy and the Australians using the Super Hornets in various ways, the Air Force also wouldn't even have to develop its operating procedures from scratch. Cooperation between international partners and the other branches alone could save millions of dollars in the process of adopting the new plane, and adopting a naval aircraft could at least in theory give the Air Force another place to land, load, and launch planes from if there are no available runways close enough in a potentially naval battlefield. However, everything we've just gone over is all assuming that the Air Force is willing to adopt a Navy plane at all.
But seriously, we should deal with the contaminant.
The Air Force has adopted Navy aircraft before, the F-4 Phantom, the A-1 Skyraider, and the A-7 Corsair II, but describing the Air Force and Navy's relationship as anything other than frenemies or rivals is being generous. The Air Force has a long history of going out of their way to avoid having to synchronize their technology and procurement with the Navy as much as they can, sometimes to the point of outright short-sighted stupidity. Back in Vietnam, the Air Force didn't want to use the Sidewinder missile because it was originally the Navy's missile, and so they adopted the objectively worse AIM-4 Falcon for their newest Phantoms and then issued a direct order to their pilots forbidding the use of the Sidewinders. This naturally did not go very well, and the order was repealed within a few years following the widespread defiance amongst pilots. Then the F-15 Eagle was pursued so aggressively in its early years of development primarily because they didn't want to adopt a Navy airplane for their next generation of fighter aircraft. Following that, the Navy got both the Legacy Hornet and the Super Hornet because Congress ordered them to adopt navalized versions of Air Force selections for both the F-16 and the F-22 competitions, neither of which worked out for the Navy and then required them to settle for either spending more taxpayer dollars or a general loss of capability. Even recently, the F/A-XX 6th generation naval fighter has been pretty much cancelled to fund the Air Force's 6th generation F-47 instead, despite the fact that the Navy plane was the only one proceeding on time.
Something doesn't feel right.
And so while the F/A-18 Super Hornets would be great for this application, I don't think the Air Force is going to buy them. Like I said before, the Air Force has stated that it is trying to build up its fleet of F-15EX Eagle IIs to take over for the A-10s, among other things. The Eagle II is the next evolution of the F-15E Strike Eagle, which by itself is the only fighter or strike-sized aircraft to have a longer maximum range than the A-10 and the Super Hornet at well over 3,000 miles. The Eagle II also outclasses the Super Hornet with more than double the weapon's hardpoints, carrying more precision weapons at once, a higher internal fuel volume with its conformal tanks, and the fastest speed of all current US fighters, all for a similar per-hour flight hour cost as the Super Hornet. But a big disadvantage is that it doesn't have the low and slow handling that a lot of people think is still needed for CAS and especially search and rescue support. Add that to Boeing wanting to focus on F-15EX production over the Super Hornet, and the Block 3 is pretty much guaranteed to only be a naval plane for the duration of its American service, regardless of how well it may or may not fit the A-10's ground-pounding role. Thank you for watching. We got merch and other links in the description, and if you like what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed.